Hi, everyone. JR Foresteros with Catalyst here, and this is Tuesday of Holy Week. And so, if you joined us for our video yesterday, I told you that during Holy Week this year, I've been trying something different where I walk through each day of what Jesus was doing each day of Holy Week and how this culminated in his execution and then, of course, his resurrection on Easter Sunday. So, we began on Palm Sunday with Jesus entering into Jerusalem. And on Sunday, we talked about all of the different expectations that were surrounding Jesus and how he was not interested in fulfilling any of those. Yesterday, we talked about the temple cleansing, and we saw that far from this being a spontaneous, violent act, this was actually a creative act of disruption. And it was a way for Jesus to illustrate that the time of the temple was over and that he was doing something new. And that really doesn't in many ways doesn't come to a head until today, until Tuesday. So you may remember yesterday I mentioned that Mark brackets the temple cleansing with the parable of the fig tree and Jesus cursing the fig tree. Well, he doesn't reinterpret that until Tuesday morning. So this morning, right? And again, what I think is so fascinating about the Tuesday is that this is the day that Jesus goes back to the temple. So again, yesterday, Monday, he cleansed the temple, made this big public demonstration, stopped people from the buying and selling and changing money that always goes on there. Today, he goes back. And so, as you can imagine, people were watching for that. They were ready for that. And the temple leaders all come out, like the chief priests and everyone. They come out and they basically meet Jesus on the steps, and they end up creating this sort of a showdown where Jesus is confronting them, and they get into this arena where they're trying to discredit him. And I mean, I think you can imagine how this would go, right? Jesus is kind of a backwoods country preacher, right? From the sticks, from the rural, uncivilized part of the country. And this is Jerusalem. This is the capital city. These are the chief priests and the scribes, the people who run God's temple. So, of course, they imagine that when they come out, they're going to have no problem discrediting Jesus in front of all of the pilgrims, because that's really their only move. They've realized that it's going to be difficult for them to arrest him or something like that because he's so popular. So they try to discredit him. And there's this interesting series of exchanges that draws in all of these different political groups. That again, political group is a little bit anachronistic because, they weren't political parties like we think of them today, but they were different groups with different understandings of what it meant to be God's people. So, the Sadducees are one of those groups. These are the most conservative of the groups in Jesus's time. They tended to be strict literalists. We might even what are the folks that interpret the Constitution as originalists, right? These are them. They sort of rejected the oral Torah and said, it's whatever's in the Torah, literally written down. That's what we follow. So they didn't believe in the resurrection and other things like that. They ran the temple, and they had pretty much accommodated themselves to Rome's rule. As long as they got to do their temple stuff, they were mostly okay. And so they come at Jesus with this question about resurrection that, again, it's twisty and turny and very interesting in its own right, but you have to kind of get deep into Jewish law to understand what's going on there with a woman marrying all these different brothers and they all die. And then, their question to Jesus is, who will she marry in the resurrection? And of course, they don't believe in the resurrection, right? So this question is not asked in good faith. It's entirely designed to trap Jesus. And he answers in such a way that they're confounded. And so the Pharisees, they take a turn. They're actually first, right? And they try, again, because it's such a politically charged time, they try to get Jesus to answer this question about paying taxes. And they figure that no matter which way he answers, he's going to be in trouble with someone. He's going to either be accused, if he says we should pay taxes, he's going to be accused of being a loyalist, right? Someone who's betraying the populace in favor of Rome. And if he says they shouldn't pay taxes, well, this is a time when Rome is really on edge anyway. And so it's going to really get him in trouble with the ruling authorities. And again, he threads the needle in such a way, and I'm sure you've heard this before, right? But he has the Pharisees produce a coin And it's, it's got Caesar's image on it, just like we put all of our presidents on our coins. And he says, so you give to Caesar what has Caesar's image on it, and you give to God what has God's image on it. And of course, what has God's image on it is us, humanity, right? We are made in the image of God. So it's this really elegant way of sidestepping the issue and of answering in such a way that he not only speaks to a deeper truth that actually would impress the Pharisees quite a bit, but also threads the needle of not upsetting Rome, but doing it in such a way that he doesn't look like a coward. And so the temple showdown ends with all of these different groups who have come forward to confront Jesus and protect the institution of the temple being confounded. So Jesus spends some time teaching and healing, and then they leave. He and his disciples leave, and as they leave, the disciples are marveling at the temple. They just can't believe how beautiful it is. And again, I mentioned yesterday, right? This is Herod's renovation of the temple, and so he spent tremendous amounts of money making this a world-class temple, something that rivals even the most beautiful temples in Rome. So it was a point of pride for the Jewish people that their temple to their God could stand among all of the temples in the world. And Jesus does two things here that tell us that he is unimpressed with the temple. The first is that he sees a widow coming up, and she drops 2 coins. I mean, essentially, think of like 2 pennies, right? 2 pennies into the treasury box. And he points her out to the disciples and says, all of these other people are making a big show about how much they're giving. And yet this woman has given just 2 copper coins, and it's all she has. And so she has given more than anyone else here. Now, this text often gets used to praise the woman, and it's used as a text to talk about how, it doesn't matter how much you give. What matters is that you give as much as you can. And what we see Jesus doing here instead is actually lamenting what this woman is giving, because he has already said that it's no longer the season for the temple, right? And then he's about to go on and predict the destruction of the temple, which we know happens about 40 years after his execution in 70 CE is when Rome finally destroys the temple. And so Jesus goes on after his disciples are marveling at how amazing and beautiful this temple is. He says, not one stone is going to be left on another. And then he takes them out of the city and he takes them up to the Mount of Olives, and he gives them this sermon that scholars have called the Markan Apocalypse, because it's got all of the hallmarks of apocalyptic literature, at least in the sense of the doom and the gloom. It's got the sun going black, and the moon turning to blood, and people hiding, and all of this torment and destruction. And again, most scholars think that this is talking about Rome's destruction of Jerusalem and the final end of the era of the Jewish temple, because to this day there has not been another temple rebuilt in Jerusalem. And so it really does mark the end in many ways of the kind of ancient Judaism as we knew it. After this, Judaism becomes fully a religion of text in the way that it had begun to after the destruction of the first temple. And the Pharisees actually end up becoming sort of the group that survives, because the Sadducees were so tied to the temple. The Pharisees are the ones that end up becoming the sort of rabbinic Judaism that we're familiar with today. So there's a through line from the Pharisees of Jesus's day to the Jewish branches that we know today, from Orthodox all the way over to Reform Judaism. And I should mention here too, though the Pharisees often are painted as the bad guys of the Gospels, Jesus actually has the most in common with the Pharisees of any of the kinds of Judaism. He was called a rabbi And he and the Pharisees, their theology was the most similar. In fact, I think from an outsider looking in, they would have considered Jesus a part of Pharisaism in the way that he understood what the scriptures are, and the way he understood how God relates to the people and what the people's responsibilities towards God are. Jesus was very much in the camp of Pharisees, which is probably why they clashed the most, right? We always tend to have the strongest and sharpest disagreements with the people that were the closest to in terms of ideology. People who are radically different from us, we tend not to, fight with that much. Anyway, so all that to say, Pharisees are not bad guys, and yeah, we need to be careful how we treat them when we read the New Testament. But back to this whole temple end of an era thing. I think it's difficult for a lot of us to imagine how it would have felt for Jesus to announce the end of the temple, because we don't have temples, right? We don't worship at them. In fact, if the church that we attend burns down or closes the doors or something like that, we could just go to another church. It's no big deal. I mean, it's a little bit of a deal. There might be some emotional attachment to the physical space, but it's not the only one, right? To try to imagine the end of the temple, we have to imagine that, like, suddenly there's just no more church anywhere, no houses of worship at all, and trying to imagine how that would change what it even means for us to be faithful, I think starts to get us in the direction of what the disciples were hearing when they heard Jesus say that the temple was coming to an end. And yet the temple had ceased to fulfill its holy function. And so for Jesus, he understood that this was the end. This was the end. And this gets interpreted quite a lot in the first couple of centuries of Christianity. I think one of the places you see this most clearly is in John's gospel, where Jesus presents himself as the new temple. So, in John 1, where it says the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, the Greek for made his dwelling is actually the word tabernacle. So it's a very rigid literalist translation would be the word became flesh and tabernacled among us. And again, if you remember from yesterday, the tabernacle is the temple. Those are the same building functionally. So Jesus is the temple. In fact, in John's version of Jesus predicting the end of the temple, John pops in and says, when Jesus says, tear down this temple and I'll raise it again in 3 days, he's talking about the temple of his body. So there's all of these little things in John's gospel that make it clear that Jesus is the new temple, which again makes sense, right? If the temple is the site where heaven and earth overlap, where God and the people become one, well, that's Jesus, where human and God become one fully in the incarnation. So there's all kinds of cool theology there, but the disciples are hearing none of that. What they're hearing is the entire way they know how to interact with God is coming to an end, and it's almost too big for them to process. And I don't like to be dramatic, but I do think we're in a similar kind of era right now. I think the ways that we have interacted with God throughout probably the last 500 years or so are no longer working for a lot of us. I'm thinking particularly of denominations. Again, there was a time when denominations were formed to resource churches and to make churches impact on the world bigger. So when it came to sending missionaries and things like that, you could group together and get more done. I think the real problem with denominations is they quickly become institutions of their own, and they're no longer agile. They can no longer respond to change. Institutions are always self-protective, and so rather than responding to changes in the world, rather than being able to stand up for against injustice and to stand up for vulnerable populations, denominations see how risky that is, and they see that it would cost them influence and power, and so they tend to either be silent or to speak up in favor of a more conservative voice. So we say that in my denomination, the one that Catalyst is a part of, Church of the Nazarene, we're moving backwards when it comes to LGBTQ plus inclusion. We have been definitely silent when it comes to race, even with gender, which our denomination is one that has ordained women since the beginning. We have done a terrible job of actually empowering and equipping women that we ordain. And again, that's because it's just easier to say nothing than it is to speak up and cause controversy. And so what we have is tons of Nazarene churches that won't even consider a female senior pastor, even though in theory we should be like 50-50 in our denomination, right? We have a denomination that is actively taking steps to harm clergy who are queer affirming. We have a denomination that refuses to say anything about the killing of unarmed black men in our country again and again and again. And so, again, I think this is what Jesus is talking about when he's talking about the end of the temple and how it's not bearing fruit and how that means it's going to come to an end. That I think that's what's happening in our denomination here. You look at what's happening with the Southern Baptists, right, around the way that they've protected sexual predation, and again the way they've refused to repent of their racist history and how that's continuing to have effects into the present. I think that the kind of fear that we feel about losing these institutions that have given us shape and purpose for so long is something really similar to what the disciples would have been feeling when Jesus is calling for the end of the temple. And so I think it's worth, as we go into Holy Week this week, talking about what it means for us as a church and as Christians to hear Jesus announcing the end of these institutions that are no longer a force for good in the world, and what it means for us to have faith that even as these institutions crumble under their own weight, under their own unwillingness to change, what does it look like for us to remain faithful to Jesus and trust that ultimately the church is not found in institutions or in denominations, but it's Jesus and Jesus's church. And if we take John seriously, that Jesus is the temple, he is the space where heaven and earth overlap, then when we are continuing to be found in Jesus, we will be part of the church, whatever the church looks like in its next incarnation. So I know those are big questions, but this is what Holy Week is all about, I think. And so tomorrow we're going to be looking at what Jesus was up to on Wednesday. But until then, I hope you have a blessed day. I hope that Jesus is near to you, and I hope you can sense that. Grace and peace be with you.